June 6, 1944. 0415 hours. Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The room smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, layered thick as morning fog. Dwight David Eisenhower stood at the window, his palm pressed flat against the cold glass, watching rain streak down in irregular patterns that looked like Morse code spelling out words he couldn't decipher. Behind him, the weight of 3 million men pressed against his shoulders, Americans, British, Canadians, all waiting for an order he wasn't certain he should give. His reflection in the window showed a face he barely recognized. 53 years old, hair receded, jaw set in a way that suggested confidence his gut contradicted. "The meteorologists say there's a break coming," Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory said behind him, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man offering a lifeline he doesn't quite believe in himself. Eisenhower didn't turn. Outside, the English Channel churned like a living thing trying to swallow the future whole. In his pocket, folded into a square the size of a playing card, sat a handwritten message he'd prepared hours earlier. "Our landings have failed and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He'd written July 5th at the top by mistake, then crossed it out. Even his subconscious was trying to postpone the inevitable. This was not supposed to be his story. Nothing about Dwight Eisenhower's life had pointed toward this moment, standing in an English manor house, holding the fate of Western civilization in hands, more accustomed to shuffling papers than commanding armies. 25 years earlier, a younger Eisenhower had graduated 61st in a class of 164 from West Point. 61st. Not top of the class, not distinguished, not memorable. The yearbook staff had written, "Now, fellers, this is Dwight David Ike Eisenhower, the terrible Swedish Jew. He's the handsomest man in the Corps and the biggest lady killer at the point." They'd meant it as a joke. The farm boy from Abilene, Kansas, population 6,000 souls and twice as many regrets, had been good at football until a knee injury ended that dream. Good at poker, good at making friends, good at being pleasant, not good at being exceptional. His mother, Ida, had raised him as a pacifist, a devout Jehovah's Witness who kept a Bible in the kitchen and believed war was mankind's greatest sin. She'd wept when he told her about West Point. Not tears of pride, tears of mourning, as though he'd announced his own death. "It's your choice," she'd said, her voice brittle as autumn leaves, "but you must live with it." He'd chosen the military because it offered education, stability, a way out of poverty. Not because he dreamed of battle, not because he thirsted for glory. The United States Army circa 1915 was a sleepy bureaucratic organism that spent more time on parade grounds than battlefields. It seemed safe, respectable, dull. Then came the Great War, and Eisenhower didn't go. While his classmates shipped to France and returned as heroes or corpses or traumatized shells of their former selves, Captain Eisenhower remained stateside, training tank crews at Camp Colt, Pennsylvania. He'd requested combat duty 17 times, 17 rejections. The Army had looked at his administrative skills and decided he was more valuable as a trainer than a warrior. It felt like mercy that tasted like humiliation. For 2 decades after the armistice, Eisenhower languished in the peacetime military purgatory of transferred postings and staff positions. Fort Meade, Camp Gaillard in Panama, the American Battle Monuments Commission in Washington, Paris for a year, Manila for 4. He wrote reports. He organized logistics. He served under General Fox Connor in Panama, a brilliant theorist who saw something in the unremarkable major that others missed. Connor had fought in the Meuse-Argonne, had seen the abattoir of modern warfare firsthand, and Connor told Eisenhower something that would lodge in his mind like a splinter. The next war will be a war of coalitions. The commander who can hold together an alliance will matter more than the commander who can win a battle. Eisenhower had listened politely, the way you listen to a professor discussing theoretical mathematics that will never apply to your life of teaching high school algebra. By 1939, when Hitler's panzers rolled into Poland, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower was 50 years old, stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington, unknown outside a small circle of Army staff officers who appreciated his talent for turning chaos into organizational charts. He had never commanded troops in combat, had never heard artillery fire in anger, had never ordered men to their deaths. His service record was immaculate and invisible, the resume of a competent functionary destined to retire at modest rank and write memoirs nobody would read. Then the world caught fire, and everything inverted. 1941, 1942, 1943. The acceleration was dizzying. Chief of Staff George Marshall, a man who'd known Eisenhower from earlier staff postings, kept promoting him past officers with combat experience, past officers with seniority, past officers with fame. Brigadier General, Major General, Lieutenant General, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in North Africa. "Why me?" Eisenhower had asked Marshall during one of their conversations in the War Department's corridors that smelled of floor wax and perpetual urgency. Marshall had given him a look that contained volumes. "Because you don't want glory. You want to win and go home. That makes you different from every other general in this army." It was true, though Eisenhower had never articulated it that way. While Patton craved headlines and Montgomery demanded deference and MacArthur staged photographs, Eisenhower just wanted the dying to stop. He approached war the way a surgeon approaches a tumor: regrettable necessity, minimum damage, maximum efficiency. No romance, no illusions. The North Africa campaign had tested that philosophy against reality's grinding wheel. Operation Torch in November of 1942. 107,000 Allied troops landing in Morocco and Algeria, while Eisenhower commanded from a damp tunnel in Gibraltar, so deep underground he couldn't tell if it was day or night. The first reports came in fragmented, contradictory. Casualties at Oran, resistance at Casablanca. French forces fighting Americans because politics was more complicated than bullets. He'd made deals with Vichy Admiral François Darlan, a collaborator, a man whose handshake felt like handling something dead, because it saved lives even as it cost moral clarity. The press had crucified him for it. "Eisenhower makes pact with fascist," the headline screamed. British politicians questioned his judgment. American senators demanded explanations. But the fighting had stopped 3 days earlier than projected, and 2,000 men who would have died kept breathing. He'd lain awake in his quarters, chain-smoking Camel cigarettes until his throat burned, trying to calculate if he'd made the right choice or merely the expedient one. Tunisia had been worse. The Green American troops had walked into Rommel's veterans at Kasserine Pass and been slaughtered. 2,000 casualties in 2 days. Eisenhower had visited the field hospitals afterward, walked among boys missing limbs and futures, their blood turning the sand dark. One private from Iowa, 19 years old, both legs gone above the knee, had grabbed Eisenhower's wrist with surprising strength. "Did we do good, sir? Did we do good?" The kid's eyes were desperate for meaning, for validation that his sacrifice had purchased something worthwhile. "You did good, son," Eisenhower had said, his throat tight as a fist. "You did good." Outside, he'd vomited behind a medical tent, then wiped his mouth and returned to headquarters to plan the next offensive. There was no time for grief, no space for doubt, just the machinery of war demanding constant feeding. Sicily, Italy, the slow grinding push up the peninsula against soldiers who fought for every ridge, every village, every meter of mud and stone. Eisenhower learned that coalition warfare meant endless political navigation. Churchill wanted one thing, Roosevelt another, de Gaulle a third, the British field marshals a fourth. Personalities clashed like tectonic plates. Patton's brilliance and instability, Montgomery's competence and arrogance, Clark's ambition, Bradley's steadiness. Eisenhower spent half his time mediating disputes between allies, who should have been united and sometimes seemed more interested in post-war positioning than winning the war at hand. He discovered a talent he hadn't known he possessed, the ability to absorb everyone's anger and ego, neutralize it, redirect it toward the enemy. He was a lightning rod and a diplomat, a buffer and a catalyst. Not inspiring like Churchill, not charismatic like Roosevelt, just relentlessly reasonable, willing to listen for hours, capable of finding compromise where others found only impasse. It was exhausting. It was unglamorous. It worked. By the spring of 1944, Eisenhower commanded Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 men in the first wave, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft. The calculus was brutal. Military analysts estimated 30,000 casualties on the first day. 30,000. Eisenhower had signed letters to the families of the dead before they'd even died, because someone had to, and he'd decided that someone should be him. Back at Southwick House, the clock read 0430. 15 minutes had passed since Lee Mallory spoke, or 15 hours. Time moved strangely at the hinges of history. Eisenhower turned from the window. The assembled commanders watched him, faces he'd come to know like family. Men who'd argue with him about tactics, then share whiskey in quiet moments. Professionals who trusted him even when they disagreed. The weight of their expectation was almost physical. "Okay," he said. "Just that. One word. We'll go." The room exhaled collectively. Orders were issued. Men moved towards ships that would carry them across the channel into machine gun fire and exploding shells in history's memory. Eisenhower walked outside into the rain, let it soak his uniform, stood among the vehicles preparing to depart. He shook hands, made small talk, smiled as though he felt confident. One paratrooper from Kansas, a coincidence that felt like a sign, asked him where he was from. "Abilene," Eisenhower said. "No kidding, sir. My uncle farms near there. Wheat country." "Best wheat country in the world," Eisenhower replied. And for a moment he wasn't the supreme commander of Allied forces. He was just Ike from Abilene, talking to a neighbor about home. "See you in Berlin, sir," the paratrooper said, grinning. "See you in Berlin," Eisenhower echoed, though he knew the statistical probability was that he'd never see this particular young man again. The invasion succeeded. Not perfectly. The casualty estimates had been too optimistic at some beaches, too pessimistic at others, but it succeeded. The Atlantic Wall broke. The liberation of Europe commenced. And Eisenhower, the general who'd never wanted war, managed the coalition that won it. He'd thought the weight would lift when Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. It didn't. The death camps revealed horrors that exceeded imagination. Eisenhower had ordered every soldier, every officer, every war correspondent to visit the camps, to see what they'd been fighting against. He'd walked through Ohrdruf himself, seen the bodies stacked like cordwood, the living skeletons staring with eyes that had seen hell. He'd ordered extensive photographs and documentation because, he'd said, "Get it all on record now. Get the films. Get the witnesses. Because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened." The Liberator General returning to victory parades and ticker tape, America wanted him to smile and wave and embody triumph. Instead, he carried the weight of camps and casualty reports. The knowledge of how close it had all come to failing, the memory of every compromise and terrible calculation. The Army wanted him for Chief of Staff. Columbia University wanted him for President. NATO wanted him for Supreme Commander. The nation wanted him for President of the United States. Everyone wanted Eisenhower because he'd proven capable of holding impossible things together through sheer stubborn decency. "I like Ike" became the campaign slogan in 1952. Simple, friendly, utterly inadequate to capture the complexity of the man. He'd won in a landslide against Adlai Stevenson, 442 electoral votes to 89. The farm boy from Abilene, the 61st graduate in his class, the general who'd never wanted war, became the 34th President of the United States. The Korean War was still burning when he took office on January 20th, 1953. American casualties exceeded 120,000. The front had stabilized into something resembling the trenches of the Great War his mother had mourned, static, grinding, pointless. His campaign promise had been simple. "I shall go to Korea." He went, flew to the peninsula, visited the front lines, talked to soldiers huddled in frozen trenches. And he made the decision his military instincts told him was correct. End it. Not with victory parades, not with triumph. Just end it. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Not a peace treaty, just an agreement to stop killing. It felt insufficient and necessary, like most of his decisions. His presidency became defined by things that didn't happen. Nuclear war didn't happen, despite multiple crises where advisors urged first strikes. The Cold War stayed cold through calculation and restraint. He'd authorized the development of the interstate highway system, 41,000 miles of roads connecting the nation, partly for defense, partly because he'd seen the Autobahn and understood infrastructure as investment in peace. Little Rock, Arkansas, September 1957. Governor Orville Faubus deployed the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Central High School. Eisenhower had hesitated, the Southern Democrat in him uncomfortable with federal intervention, the general in him understanding that orders meant nothing if not enforced. He'd sent the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles who jumped into Normandy, federal troops escorting teenagers to school. The images had broadcast worldwide, evidence that America was changing slowly, painfully, over the objections of those who preferred the comfortable violence of the old order. His farewell address in January 1961 became his most quoted speech. He'd written it himself, pacing his office, crossing out phrases, searching for language adequate to the warning he needed to deliver. The military-industrial complex, that phrase would outlive him. The professional soldier warning about the permanent war economy, the general who'd seen what war meant, cautioning against those who profited from it. "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence," he'd said, his voice steady as Kansas wheat fields under summer sun. "The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." The irony wasn't lost on him. The supreme commander of Allied forces in World War II warning about military power. The general who'd authorized CIA coups in Iran and Guatemala cautioning about unchecked authority. He contained contradictions the way Kansas contained both tornadoes and harvest, simultaneously, inevitably. By the time Dwight David Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969, his reputation had grown complicated. The 1960s had turned against men like him, old soldiers, cautious moderates, organization men who believed in institutions and process. The young wanted revolution. The establishment wanted order. Eisenhower had offered something less exciting and more difficult. Competent management of impossible problems, steady hands on wheels that everyone else wanted to jerk dramatically left or right. History has been kinder than his contemporaries. Decades later, historians rank him among the most effective presidents, not for soaring rhetoric or transformative vision, but for exactly the qualities he'd brought to coalition warfare. The ability to hold together competing forces, to make unglamorous decisions that prevented catastrophe, to prioritize outcome over ego. His mother Ida had died in 1946, shortly after the war's end. The pacifist who'd mourned her son's choice to attend West Point had lived to see him become the most famous general in the world. They'd never fully reconciled the contradiction, her faith, his career, but in her final letter to him, she'd written, "I pray you brought more peace than war." He'd kept that letter in his desk drawer through his presidency, rereading it during difficult nights when decisions felt impossible. More peace than war. It was the only measurement that mattered, not victory, not glory, not legacy, just the simple arithmetic of suffering prevented, lives preserved, catastrophes avoided. The window at Southwick House on June 6, 1944, rain streaming down, 3 million men waiting, the future uncertain as fog, had crystallized everything. He'd had to choose between terrible options, knowing the cost would be paid in other people's blood. And he'd chosen not because he wanted to, but because someone had to, and the universe had placed him at that particular intersection of responsibility and authority. That was his story, not the hero who sought greatness, but the reluctant servant who shouldered burdens because they needed carrying. The general who didn't want war, who nevertheless prosecuted it with grim efficiency when war became unavoidable. The president who understood that sometimes the greatest victory is preventing the fight from starting. In the end, Dwight David Eisenhower from Abilene, Kansas, 61st in his class, unremarkable and indispensable, proved that competence is a form of courage, that steady hands matter more than dramatic gestures, that the person who doesn't want power might be exactly the person who should wield it. His mother's prayer had been answered, though not in ways she could have imagined. He'd brought more peace than war. Not perfectly, not easily, but measurably, undeniably, stubbornly, he'd brought more peace than war. The rain still falls on Southwick House. The channel still churns. And somewhere in the space between what we expect of heroes and what heroes actually do, Eisenhower's ghost stands at a window, palm pressed to cold glass, carrying the weight of decisions that don't allow for certainty, only for choosing, living with consequences, and moving forward into whatever comes next.